The night had swallowed everything. There was no moon, no stars breaking through the thick blanket of clouds that hung over the Arabian Sea like a suffocating hand. Commander James Mitchell could barely see his own hands in front of his face, let alone the faces of his men spread out along the rocky shore behind him. He could only feel them, the tension in the air, the careful breathing, the weight of weapons held ready. They had come in silent, the way Navy SEALs always did, and now they were waiting in the darkness for the signal that would tell them whether this night would end in success or disaster. The operation was supposed to be simple. Too simple, Mitchell thought, and that was what worried him. In his 23 years of military service, he had learned that simple operations were usually the ones where someone made a mistake. Someone always made a mistake. They were here to extract intelligence from a compound located just beyond this stretch of beach. The compound belonged to a man named Rashid al-Mansour, a regional commander for a network that had been making trouble for American interests throughout the Indian Ocean and beyond. The intelligence suggested that al-Mansour would be in the compound tonight, and if they could take him alive, the information he possessed could save countless lives. Mitchell checked his watch. The luminous hands showed 2,247 hours. They were 13 minutes ahead of schedule, which meant the team that was supposed to be creating a distraction on the other side of the compound was also getting ahead of schedule. He pressed the radio transmitter against his mouth, careful to keep his voice low and steady. "Alpha Team, this is command. Hold your position. Repeat, hold your position. We wait for the signal." The response came back immediately, calm and professional. "Alpha holding. Ready to proceed on your mark." Mitchell lowered the radio and looked toward the beach. His second-in-command, Lieutenant David Chen, was crouched about 30 feet away, his sniper rifle positioned on a small outcropping of rock that gave him a clear view of the compound's main entrance. Chen had been with Mitchell for 8 years. They had worked together on operations across 3 continents, and Mitchell trusted him more than he trusted most people in his own family. Chen would be watching, waiting, ready for anything. The plan was solid. Team Alpha would go in through the main gate, secured by Chen's covering fire. Team Bravo would move around the eastern wall and breach from the back. Team Charlie would wait with the boats in case they needed a rapid extraction. Mitchell would be with Alpha, moving through the compound until they found al-Mansour. In and out. 30 minutes, maximum. They had done things like this before. They could do it again. But something felt wrong. It was a feeling in Mitchell's gut, a small voice that had never steered him wrong in 2 decades of combat. He had learned to trust that voice, to listen to it even when everything else said he was being paranoid. He looked around at his men, at the young faces painted with black camouflage, at the steady hands that gripped their weapons, at the eyes that reflected his own determination. They trusted him. They had trained for this. They were ready. Mitchell took a deep breath and keyed the radio again. "All teams, this is command. Final equipment check. Report status." The reports came back one by one. All green. All ready. All good to go. Mitchell checked his watch again. 6 minutes now. He began to move, signaling to his team with quiet hand gestures that were understood without words. They had practiced these movements so many times that they could do them in their sleep. Alpha Team began to advance slowly toward the compound's perimeter, moving like ghosts through the darkness. The first 200 meters went perfectly. No alarms, no guards spotting them, no signs that anyone inside the compound even knew they were coming. Mitchell's heart was beating steady and strong. They were going to pull this off. They were going to get in, grab their target, and get out before anyone even knew what had happened. His training had taught him to expect success, to visualize it, to make it real in his mind before his body carried it out. They were 250 meters from the main gate when the first explosion lit up the night sky. It came from the east side of the compound, the side where Team Bravo was supposed to be moving into position. The blast was large, larger than anything that should have been there. Mitchell's mind immediately understood what was happening, even as his body was already moving, already reacting, already shifting from offense to defense. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't anything they had planned for. Contact! Contact on the east! The voice of Team Bravo's leader, Captain Marcus Rodriguez, came through the radio, urgent and controlled even as Mitchell could hear gunfire in the background. We have IEDs. We're taking fire from inside the compound. Mitchell's mind was racing. Improvised explosive devices. That meant they had known. Someone had tipped them off. The intelligence was bad. The operation was compromised. All teams, this is command. Fall back to the beach. Abort mission. Repeat, abort mission. But, even as he was giving those orders, Mitchell realized the problem. Team Bravo was pinned down on the east side, taking heavy fire. They couldn't move back to the beach without exposing themselves to more explosions and bullets. And, if Team Bravo couldn't move, then, Team Alpha couldn't leave them behind. That was the rule. No one left behind. That was what it meant to be a SEAL. Team Bravo, suppress that fire and move to the beach. We're coming to get you, Mitchell said, his voice steady even though his mind was already calculating angles and distances and probability of survival. Can't move, command. We're pinned down hard. 2 men down. Requesting air support. Mitchell could hear the pain and urgency in Rodriguez's voice. 2 men down. That meant wounded. That meant they were running out of time. They had maybe 5 minutes before whoever was in the compound realized they had SEALs to deal with and started bringing serious firepower to bear. Alpha team, with me. We're going to suppress their fire and get Bravo out of there. Mitchell gestured hard to his men, and they began moving toward the east side of the compound, using the small hills and rocks as cover as they ran across the beach. The gunfire was constant now, a steady stream of bullets that seemed to be coming from multiple points within the compound walls. Mitchell could see the muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly stars. His men were moving with him, running low, firing as they moved, providing covering fire for Team Bravo. Bullets were hitting the rocks around them, sending up sprays of sand and stone. Mitchell made it to a position about 100 meters from where Team Bravo was pinned down. He could see Rodriguez and 2 other men huddled behind a low wall, with 2 more men lying motionless on the ground between them and the compound. One of them was still moving slightly, which meant at least one of the wounded was still alive. Rodriguez, on my mark, you move toward us. Alpha team will provide fire. 3, 2, 1, move. Rodriguez and his men started running toward Mitchell's position, low and fast. The gunfire intensified. More bullets came down the beach, some of them hitting dangerously close. Mitchell was firing his weapon steadily, trying to keep the enemy heads down, trying to buy his men enough time to reach safety. One of Rodriguez's men fell. Just dropped. At first, Mitchell thought he had tripped, but then, he saw the blood spreading across the sand. The man had been hit. Mitchell's jaw clenched. Another SEAL down. But Rodriguez didn't stop. He kept running, and he grabbed the wounded man, hauling him up and dragging him toward Mitchell's position. The other SEAL was right behind him, firing his weapon while running backward, covering their retreat. They reached Mitchell's position just as the gunfire seemed to reach a fever pitch. Mitchell could see muzzle flashes everywhere now. There were more enemy soldiers in that compound than any of their intelligence had suggested. Far more. And they were well-trained and well-supplied. This wasn't a typical militia group they were dealing with. This was something different. Something worse. We're all here that can make it, Rodriguez said, breathing hard, blood on his uniform. Jenkins and Martinez are still out there. They're both down. I don't think. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Mitchell's heart sank. 2 of his men were gone. Maybe 3 if Jenkins and Martinez were as bad off as Rodriguez's voice suggested. But there was no time to process that. No time to grieve. They were still taking fire. They were still in danger. And they had to move. Fall back to the boats. Now. Go, go, go. Alpha Team began moving down the beach toward the water, where the boats and Team Charlie were waiting. Mitchell was behind them, continuing to fire at the compound, trying to keep the enemy focused on him and away from his retreating men. Bullets were coming at him from at least 3 different directions. He could feel the wind of them passing, could hear the sharp crack as they came close. Then, something changed. A single shot rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the chaos of gunfire like a knife cutting through silk. It came from a direction Mitchell hadn't expected, a direction that was coming from out toward the water, away from the compound entirely. The gunfire from the compound stopped. Not all at once, but in rapid succession. One enemy position went silent, then another, then another. Within seconds, the constant deadly stream of bullets had been reduced to scattered, panicked fire. Mitchell's mind was trying to understand what was happening. He looked out toward the water, trying to see where that shot had come from. The darkness was too thick. He couldn't see anything. But he could hear the sound of movement in the water, something or someone moving with purpose. Then, he saw it. A figure was rising from the sea, pulling itself up out of the water with strong, practiced movements. Even in the darkness, Mitchell could see the shape of a man, the outline of equipment, the unmistakable form of a military-grade sniper rifle in the figure's hands. Who in the name of God was that? The sniper was moving along the beach now, still firing, taking out enemy positions with methodical precision. Whoever this person was, they were a professional. Every shot was a hit. Every movement was calculated and efficient. It was like watching an angel of death rise from the ocean itself. Mitchell's men had reached the boats now, and Team Charlie was already helping the wounded inside. Mitchell himself was backing toward the water, his eyes still fixed on the mysterious sniper emerging from the darkness like some kind of avenging ghost. "Who are you?" Mitchell called out, not sure if the figure would even hear him over the gunfire, not sure what else to do in the face of something so unexpected. The figure turned toward him, and, in that moment, as the clouds briefly parted and starlight hit the water, Mitchell could see the face. Even covered in seawater and black camouflage, even after all these years, he would have known that face anywhere. It was impossible. It was completely impossible. But it was real. It was Paul Hendricks. His closest friend. His partner on more operations than he could count. The man who was supposed to be dead. The boat cut through the water at maximum speed, moving away from the beach where the gunfire was now becoming sporadic and distant. Mitchell was in the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the controls even though his mind was anything but steady. Behind him, his men were dealing with the wounded. Rodriguez was applying tourniquets to the man who had been shot during their retreat. Another SEAL, Thompson, was performing CPR on Jenkins, though the expression on his face suggested he already knew it was too late. And, beside Mitchell, still dripping with seawater and holding the deadly sniper rifle like it was part of his body, was Paul Hendricks. Paul looked exactly the same as he had 3 years ago, before that operation in Yemen where an IED had taken his life. Or at least, that was what everyone had been told. Mitchell had attended his funeral. He had held Paul's widow while she cried. He had stood in the rain at Arlington Cemetery and listened to the folding of the flag. All of that had been real. All of that had been genuine. And, yet, here Paul was, solid and real and very much alive. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Paul said, and his voice was exactly the way Mitchell remembered it, calm and slightly amused, even in the worst situations. Mitchell didn't respond immediately. He was trying to process too many things at once. The ambush. The mysterious sniper. The impossible return of a dead man. His mind was jumping between anger and confusion and a strange relief that his old friend hadn't actually been gone all these years. "Jenkins is dead," Rodriguez called from the back. His voice was hollow. "And Martinez too. They got him back at the LZ." The words hit hard. 2 good men. 2 of their team. Gone. Mitchell's hands tightened on the controls, but he didn't change course. They had to get back to the ship. They had to get the wounded to medical. Everything else would have to wait. How did you know? Mitchell finally asked Paul, his eyes still on the water ahead. How did you know we were going to be hit? How did you know where we would be? Paul was looking back at the shore, his sniper rifle resting against his shoulder. I didn't. Not exactly. I've been following Al-Mansour for 3 weeks. I know his patterns better than he knows them himself. When I saw the radioactivity increase tonight, I knew something was happening. So I got close to see what it was. When I saw the compound light up, I figured you people were in trouble. You people? Mitchell turned his head, one eyebrow raised. Paul, you're Navy. You're Navy SEAL. You're supposed to be dead? Paul finished. Yeah, I know. That's complicated. Everything is complicated, Mitchell said. But that particular complication got a lot of people killed tonight. Jenkins and Martinez aren't coming home. 2 other men are hurt bad. And somehow you're here, supposedly 3 years dead, rescuing my team. So how about we uncomplicate things? Start from the beginning. What happened in Yemen? Paul was quiet for a moment, and, when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of that calm assurance. In Yemen, I found something I wasn't supposed to find. Intelligence that suggested one of our own people, someone high up in the chain of command, was working with Al-Mansour and his network. I was trying to get evidence when that IED went off. Except it wasn't an accident, James. And it wasn't hit. It was placed. And the person I was investigating made sure it was placed right where I would find it. Mitchell's stomach dropped. You're saying someone from our side did that? I'm saying someone from our side tried to kill me, Paul confirmed. And they almost succeeded. The explosion got the 2 men I was with. They're genuinely dead. I took some shrapnel, got hit by the blast wave, and the person who was after me thought I went down with them. By the time I woke up 3 days later in a private hospital in Dubai, they had already reported me dead. They had already held the funeral. And I realized that if I tried to come back, if I tried to tell anyone what I knew, the next attempt wouldn't miss. So I stayed dead. For 3 years, Mitchell said. For 3 years, Paul agreed. I spent the first 6 months recovering. The next 2.5 years, I spent tracking him. Gathering evidence. Learning who he was working with, what he was doing, how far this thing actually goes. Mitchell pushed the boat a little faster, the engine roaring as they moved away from the shore. Who? Who's the person you've been tracking? Admiral Thomas Grayson. Mitchell's hands jerked on the controls, and, for a moment, the boat veered slightly off course before he corrected it. Admiral Thomas Grayson was the Deputy Director of Naval Operations. He was one of the most senior officers in the Navy. He was someone Mitchell had seen at briefings, someone who had helped plan operations, someone who had been presented to the public as a hero who had risen through the ranks on merit and intelligence. That's impossible, Mitchell said flatly. Grayson he's one of the good ones. Everyone knows that. He's been fighting against this kind of corruption since before we were even in the Navy. No, Paul said. He's been orchestrating it. He's been building a network of people, military officers, government contractors, intelligence analysts, who are selling information and equipment to terrorist organizations. And not small stuff. We're talking about weapons systems, tactical intelligence, encryption codes. The kind of things that get soldiers killed. The kind of things that destabilize entire regions. Mitchell wanted to argue. Every instinct he had was screaming that this was crazy, that Paul was wrong, that someone had poisoned his mind while he was in hiding. But he also knew Paul. He had trained with him. He had fought with him. He had saved his life more than once, and Paul had done the same for him. Paul wasn't the type to make wild accusations without evidence. If he was saying this, then he had evidence. Where is this evidence? Mitchell asked. That's the problem, Paul said. The evidence is sealed up in a location that only Grayson knows how to access. He keeps it like insurance. As long as he's alive and in position, the people working with him stay loyal. They know that if something happens to him, the evidence goes public. But Grayson himself isn't stupid. He's built in safeguards, access protocols, people he trusts at the highest levels. So you can't get to it, Mitchell said. Not alone, Paul admitted. And that's why I've been watching from the shadows. I've been waiting for someone I could trust. Someone who would believe me. Someone with the kind of access and authority to do something about it. Mitchell understood where this was going. You were waiting for me to be in a position where I would have no choice but to believe you. Actually, Paul said, I was waiting for you to be in a position where believing me would be easier than trying to explain what just happened back there. You've got men dead. You've got an ambush that shouldn't have happened. You've got evidence that someone knew your operational details. And now you've got me, rising out of the water like some kind of impossible savior, telling you that the reason all of this happened is because you stumbled into something that Admiral Grayson wanted to keep hidden. Mitchell was quiet as he piloted the boat. The ship was coming into view now, dark and silent on the horizon. His men were going to start asking questions very soon. Very loud questions. And he was going to have to answer them without making them sound completely insane. Al-Mansour, Mitchell said finally. Is he connected to Grayson? Directly, Paul said. Grayson's been supplying him with intelligence and weapons for at least 5 years. Al-Mansour isn't really his own operator. He's Grayson's asset. He's a puppet with just enough autonomy that he seems independent, but really, he's part of a much larger operation. So tonight's operation, Mitchell said, was designed to fail. Not necessarily, Paul corrected. Someone in Grayson's network told him about the operation, so they prepared for it. But I don't think they wanted it to fail too badly. They wanted it to succeed. They wanted you to get Al-Mansour, and bring him in for interrogation. And then, they wanted all of you to be killed while he was in your custody. Suicide bombing or something like that. You, your men, and your prisoner, all going out in a blaze of glory. It would have been tragic. It would have been written off as extremist retaliation. And it would have eliminated all possibility of Al-Mansour ever being interrogated about his real connections. Mitchell guided the boat alongside the ship, and, immediately, he could see the crew responding, moving to secure it. His men needed medical attention. The wounded needed to get to the ship's surgery. And Mitchell needed to figure out how to explain all of this to his commanding officer without sounding like he had lost his mind. What are you going to do? Mitchell asked Paul. I'm coming with you, Paul said. I'm going to stay hidden for now, but I'm going to be on that ship, watching and listening. Because if tonight's operation was compromised, then there's a leak somewhere in your chain of command. Someone here, on this ship, or someone who has access to your operations, is working for Grayson. And I need to figure out who. And then? Mitchell asked. And then, Paul said, we're going to bury the Admiral. We're going to do it by the book, by the law, and using the evidence to bring down everyone connected to his operation. And we're going to make sure that the people who trusted you, who believed in your leadership, know that their commander had the strength to do the right thing even when it was hard. The boat was being pulled up onto the deck now, and Mitchell could see people waiting. Medical personnel. Officers. Security teams. Questions were about to come pouring down on him like rain. I'm going to need you to trust me, Paul said. Just like you've had to do 1,000 times before. Mitchell looked at his old friend, at the ghost who had come back from the dead to save his life and complicate his world in ways that were going to take years to untangle. And he realized that despite everything, despite the shock and the confusion and the anger at having been lied to for 3 years, he did trust Paul. He always had. Get below deck, Mitchell said. Find somewhere to hide before they see you. We'll figure out the rest later. Paul nodded, and, with the kind of quiet efficiency that had made him one of the best operators Mitchell had ever known, he slipped over the side of the boat and into the darkness, disappearing into the ship like a shadow melting into deeper shade. Mitchell turned toward the waiting officers, his mind already preparing the story he would tell, the explanations he would give, the narrative that would explain what happened on the beach without mentioning the impossible resurrection of Paul Hendricks. It was going to be complicated. It was going to be dangerous. And there were people at the very highest levels of military authority who would want him dead if they knew what he was planning. But, for the first time since that operation had gone sideways, Mitchell felt like he had a chance. He had his friend back. He had someone who understood what he was facing. And, together, they might actually be able to do something that seemed impossible. The questions started immediately as he stepped out of the boat. Mitchell answered them calmly, methodically, carefully leaving out the details that mattered most. He talked about the ambush, about the unknown sniper who had saved them, about the men who had been lost. He didn't mention Paul. He didn't mention Grayson. He didn't mention any of the things that Paul had told him about networks and corruption and an admiral working against his own country. But he filed it all away, committed it to memory, and began to think about how a dead man and a living commander were going to topple one of the most powerful figures in the military establishment. It seemed impossible. But then, again, Paul Hendricks was supposed to be impossible too. He was supposed to be dead. He was supposed to be gone forever. And yet, he was here, moving through the ship like a ghost, planning the next move in a game that had taken 3 years to set up and would take months or maybe years more to finish. Mitchell went to the medical bay to check on his wounded. He called the families of the men who had died. He filed reports and gave briefings. And, all the while, he knew that Paul was somewhere on this ship, watching, listening, gathering information about who in the chain of command couldn't be trusted. As night gave way to morning, and the ship began its journey back to port, Mitchell found himself thinking about loyalty, about what it meant, about how it could be betrayed, and about what happened when someone decided to stand against impossible odds in the name of truth. Paul had spent 3 years in the shadows, gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment. Now that moment had come, and Mitchell was going to stand with him, no matter what it cost. The operation had failed. Men had died. But something else had succeeded. The ghost had come back. And, now, the real work was about to begin. The ship arrived in port at Naval Station Norfolk on a Tuesday morning. Mitchell watched from the bridge as the crew moved efficiently through the process of docking, securing the vessel, and preparing for the shore crews to begin their work. He had spent the last 4 days at sea communicating carefully with Paul, who had hidden himself in the lower sections of the ship where only a few trusted sailors had reason to go. Those sailors didn't ask questions. They had served under Mitchell long enough to know that when the commander needed something kept quiet, there was usually a good reason. 4 days. Mitchell had used every single hour to prepare for what was coming next. He had secured Paul's evidence, pictures of documents, recordings of phone conversations, emails that had been carefully extracted from encrypted servers. Paul had spent 3 years building an airtight case against Admiral Thomas Grayson. Every piece of evidence was documented. Every connection was traced. Every transaction was accounted for. What Paul had was the kind of proof that would hold up in a military court, in a civilian court, and in the court of public opinion. The problem was that Admiral Grayson didn't know about any of it. And he didn't know that Commander James Mitchell had broken his operational silence to ask very specific questions about the ambush on the beach. Mitchell had done it carefully, quietly, asking the kinds of questions that a concerned commander would naturally ask without raising any alarm. Who had access to the operational details? Who knew about the timing? Who had the authority to bring in assets that weren't part of the original mission planning? The answers had come back suspicious and vague. There were 12 people with access to the full operational details. Of those 12, one had called in a favor with a contractor in the Middle East about 6 hours before the operation was supposed to begin. That person's name was Captain William Torres, and he had been working closely with Admiral Grayson for the past 5 years. Mitchell had access to Torres's service record. He had access to Torres's communications. And he had been building a timeline that showed exactly how information had flowed from the Admiral to his operatives to Al Mansour and his network. It was a perfect picture of betrayal and corruption. And it was all going to come to light. But not on this ship. Not with Torres potentially watching. Not with people whose loyalties weren't yet clear. Mitchell had decided that the best place to move forward was somewhere safe, somewhere away from the military chain of command where Grayson had people embedded like ticks in a dog's skin. Paul was waiting for him in a small, secure office on the base. It was a room that Mitchell had used before for sensitive debriefings, a room that was monitored only by people Mitchell absolutely trusted. The moment Mitchell closed the door behind him, Paul emerged from the shadows, looking more solid and real than he had since rising from the sea 4 nights ago. Torres confirmed, Mitchell said without preamble. He made the call. It came through 2 military contractors with deep ties to Grayson's network. The trail is clean. It's clear. And it's enough. Paul nodded slowly. We're ready then. We can move forward. There's a problem, Mitchell said. If we go through normal channels, if we report this to Grayson's superiors, the Admiral will hear about it before any investigation actually gets started. These kinds of things always leak. Someone will warn him. Someone will give him a chance to destroy evidence or run. And there are too many people in his network who will protect him. So what do you suggest? Paul asked. I suggest we go directly to the Inspector General's office, Mitchell said. Not the Navy's IG. The Department of Defense IG. Someone independent from the normal chain of command. Someone who answers to Congress, not to the Pentagon structure where Grayson has his connections. We give them everything we have, and we do it in a way that doesn't give anyone a chance to interfere. Paul was quiet for a moment, processing this. That's a big step. That's going public in a way that's going to be very hard to take back. I know, Mitchell said. But we're past the point of careful planning. We're at the point where we act, and we act decisively. Because if Grayson realizes what we're doing, he's going to move against us. And he's not going to hesitate. He's already tried to kill you once. He's already been okay with letting my men die. He's not going to hold back now. Paul stood and looked out the window at the base beyond, at the sailors moving back and forth, at the ships in the harbor, at the buildings where American military power was projected and planned. The evidence I've been gathering, he said slowly, it's not just about Grayson. It's about bigger networks than that. There are military contractors involved. There are intelligence officers involved. There are people at State Department levels involved. This is huge, James. This isn't just one bad admiral. This is a corruption network that spans across multiple agencies. I know, Mitchell said. And that's exactly why we need to go to the IG. Because this isn't something that can be handled quietly. This isn't something that can be covered up or managed within the normal hierarchy. This needs to come out into the light, fully and completely. No matter who it implicates. They spent the next 6 hours going through every single piece of evidence. Mitchell had a secure computer that was isolated from the base network. Paul had the originals of the documents, physical proof that couldn't be hacked or deleted remotely. They organized everything into categories. Financial transactions. Communications. Weapons shipments. Intelligence sharing. Meetings and interactions. Everything was documented. Everything was traceable. By late afternoon, they had compiled a file that was nearly 2,000 pages long. It was comprehensive. It was devastating. And it was absolutely true. We're going to have company soon, Paul said, looking at his watch. Torres just left the base. Which means he's probably going to report to someone that he's noticed some unusual activity in the operational records. It's going to take him maybe 4 hours to find out that it was you who was digging. And then, all hell is going to break loose. How much time do we have? Mitchell asked. Maybe 8 hours before they move against us, Paul said. They'll want to discredit us first. They'll try to make it look like we're unstable, dishonest, compromised. They'll go after our records, our service history, our mental health evaluations. They'll try to make the evidence look like something we created ourselves to cover up a failed operation. It's a playbook. It's what they would do. Mitchell nodded. Then, we don't wait. We contact the IG's office right now. We get the evidence to them before they can create any counter-narrative. Once it's in their hands, we're protected. Once it's officially in the investigation process, they can't just make us disappear. Paul pulled out a satellite phone from his pack. I've had this number for 3 years. It's monitored by someone I trust in the IG's office. Direct line. Secure communication. When I call this number, things are going to move very fast. Then, call it, Mitchell said. Paul dialed. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. He didn't use names. He didn't discuss details. He just told the person on the other end that they needed to send a secure team to Norfolk immediately, that there was evidence of a major corruption network involving a high-ranking Pentagon official, and that the evidence needed to be picked up within the hour and transported to a secure location. The person on the other end apparently agreed to everything, because Paul hung up and looked at Mitchell. They're sending a team. They'll be here in approximately 45 minutes. We need to package everything and get it ready for transport. They worked quickly and efficiently, putting the documentation into a series of sealed containers marked with security classifications that made it clear this was not something to be trifled with. Mitchell used his access to get them to a secure loading dock on the base where official military shipments came and went regularly. By the time the unmarked vehicle arrived, everything was ready. The people in the vehicle weren't military. They were civilian investigators from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. They took the evidence without asking questions, verified the security seals, and left without ceremony. In less than 5 minutes, the physical proof of Admiral Grayson's corruption was gone from the base and on its way to a secure facility where it would be analyzed and catalogued for official investigation. Now, Mitchell said, we disappear. We don't have to disappear, Paul said. In fact, we shouldn't. Disappearing makes us look guilty. What we do is we go into plain sight. We stay on the base. We act normal. We go about our business. And we wait for the investigation to move forward. Grayson will try to kill us, Mitchell said flatly. Probably, Paul agreed. But he can't do it openly. Not now that the IG is involved. He can try to arrange something that looks like an accident, or he can try to have us discredited and arrested on false charges. But an outright assassination would be too obvious. It would implicate him immediately. Mitchell wanted to argue. Every instinct told him that they needed to get off the base, get somewhere safe, somewhere far away from people who had both the motive and the means to kill them. But Paul was right. And Mitchell knew it. The moment they ran, they became suspects. The moment they hid, they became guilty. The only way to survive this was to stand their ground and trust that the system would protect them now that the evidence was in the hands of people Grayson couldn't reach. So they stayed. And, for the next 72 hours, nothing happened. It was surreal. Mitchell went through his normal duties. He attended briefings. He reviewed reports. He spent time with his men, who were dealing with the trauma of losing 2 team members. He acted like nothing in his world had changed, even though he knew that it had changed fundamentally and permanently. On the morning of the 4th day, Admiral Thomas Grayson arrived on the base. His arrival was marked by a security detail that was larger than usual. Mitchell watched from a distance as the Admiral moved through the base with the kind of confidence that came from absolute certainty that he was above suspicion. Grayson didn't know yet. The investigation was still in its early stages. The evidence was still being analyzed. But it was coming. That evening, the news hit. A Pentagon spokesperson released a statement announcing that a high-ranking naval officer was being investigated for potentially serious misconduct. The statement was vague, not naming Grayson explicitly, but the military grapevine was already humming with the knowledge. By the next morning, every news outlet in the country was running stories about Admiral Thomas Grayson and the allegations against him. Mitchell watched on the television in the officers' club as journalists dug into Grayson's background. They found the suspicious financial transactions. They found the unexplained communications. They found the contractors with whom he had done business. It was all coming out now, all of it, piece by piece and story by story. Grayson's response was immediate and defiant. He called a press conference and denied every allegation. He called it a witch hunt. He called it an attempt to discredit a patriotic officer who had served his country with distinction. But his words rang hollow. The evidence was there, undeniable and clear, and the investigation was gathering momentum. Captain Torres was arrested on charges of conspiracy and corruption. Within 48 hours, he was cooperating with investigators, providing testimony about how Grayson had recruited him, trained him, and directed him to carry out specific operations on the Admiral's behalf. Torres was going to face prison time, but he was also going to get a deal, reduced sentencing in exchange for his cooperation. Other officers began to fall. A major in the intelligence community. 2 civilians who worked for defense contractors. A CIA analyst. One by one, the network was being exposed, piece by piece, person by person. Admiral Grayson was arrested on a Thursday morning. Mitchell watched as the Admiral was led away from his office in handcuffs, his face showing the kind of shock that comes when someone absolutely certain of their power suddenly realizes that they have none at all. The Admiral had believed that he was untouchable. He had believed that his position and his connections would protect him no matter what happened. He had been wrong. The court-martial began 3 months later. It was a closed proceeding at first, designed to protect the sensitive intelligence aspects of the case. But enough details leaked that the public understood the magnitude of what Grayson had done. He had sold military secrets to terrorist organizations. He had facilitated weapons transfers that had resulted in the deaths of American soldiers. He had placed operational security at risk for personal profit and power. The charges were numerous and serious, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. During the trial, Mitchell was called to testify. Paul was called to testify, though his appearance was shocking to everyone in the courtroom. The legendary Dead Seal, resurrected and revealing himself publicly for the first time in 3 years. The security aspects of Paul's story, how he had survived, how he had spent 3 years gathering evidence, how he had been waiting for the right moment to act, all of it came out in controlled, measured testimony that laid bare the corruption and the attempt to silence him. Grayson's lawyer tried to argue that Paul was unreliable, that his years in hiding had made him unstable, that his entire account should be discredited. But Paul's evidence was so comprehensive, so well documented, so clearly authentic, that the arguments fell apart. The court-martial lasted 6 weeks. The verdict was swift and unambiguous. Admiral Thomas Grayson was found guilty on all counts. He was dishonorably discharged from the Navy. He was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. And he was ordered to forfeit all pay and benefits, including his retirement. The network of corruption that Grayson had built was dismantled piece by piece. Investigations continued for months afterward, uncovering more connections, more conspiracies, more betrayals of public trust. But the core was broken. The heart of the conspiracy had been stopped. On the day that Grayson was formally discharged and taken into federal custody, Mitchell and Paul stood together watching the Admiral be transported away from the base for the last time. Grayson didn't look at them. He didn't acknowledge them. He just stared straight ahead, his face a blank mask of defeat. "It's over," Paul said quietly. "It's not over," Mitchell corrected. "Not really. It's going to take years for all of this to shake out. There are going to be investigations at multiple levels. There are going to be congressional inquiries. There are going to be changes to how we handle security clearances and how we oversee high-ranking officers. This is just the beginning of the real work." Paul nodded slowly. "But at least now the work is being done openly. At least now people know. At least now there's transparency and accountability." "You should take some time," Mitchell said. "You've spent 3 years living like a ghost. You've spent all that time gathering evidence and waiting. You should go home. You should see your family. They think you're dead. They're going to want to know that you're alive." Paul was quiet for a long moment. "My wife remarried," he said finally. 9 months after my funeral. I saw the wedding announcement in the newspaper. I didn't blame her. I was supposed to be dead. She had to move on with her life." "But, your parents?" Mitchell asked. "Your brother? They're still alive. They're still grieving." "I know," Paul said. "And I'm going to go see them. I'm going to tell them that I'm alive, and I'm going to try to explain everything that happened. I don't know if they'll understand. I don't know if they'll forgive me for letting them suffer for 3 years. But, at least I'll be able to try." Mitchell put his hand on Paul's shoulder. "You did the right thing. You know that, right? Everything you sacrificed, everything you gave up, it was worth it because you stopped something that was poisoning this organization from the inside. You saved the Navy." "I saved it for now," Paul said. "But, corruption is like a disease. It always comes back if you're not careful. There will always be people willing to compromise their honor for money or power. The only way to fight it is to keep watching, keep being vigilant, keep being willing to stand up and say something when you see something wrong." The two men stood together in silence, watching the transport vehicle disappear down the road that led away from the base. Behind them, the Navy continued its operations. Ships were being prepped. Sailors were being trained. Missions were being planned. The organization was moving forward, healing itself, becoming stronger because the infection had been removed. Mitchell would eventually be promoted to captain. He would receive commendations for his role in exposing the corruption, though the details of his actions would remain classified for years. His men, the ones who survived, would move on to other assignments, other units, other challenges. They would carry with them the knowledge that they had been part of something important, even if they couldn't always talk about what it was. Paul returned to the Navy officially. His death was explained as a classified operation that had gone wrong, and he was officially restored to active duty status. He would go on to lead special operations teams in training and planning, using his expertise to make sure that future operators were prepared for anything the world could throw at them. He would also spend a significant amount of time speaking to military audiences about loyalty, integrity, and the importance of ethical behavior, even when doing the right thing came at a terrible personal cost. The corruption network that Grayson had built was eventually mapped completely. It extended into 3 continents and involved more than 50 people across military, government, and private industry. The investigations that followed led to additional arrests, additional trials, and additional reform within the Department of Defense. New oversight procedures were implemented. New security protocols were established. New training was mandated for officers in leadership positions about ethical responsibilities and the dangers of corruption. Years later, when military historians looked back on this period, they would call it the Grayson corruption crisis, and they would point to it as a pivotal moment in the modernization of military oversight and ethics. And, at the center of that story would be 2 men, a commander who had been willing to trust his instincts and an operator who had been willing to sacrifice everything to do what was right. The photograph that would come to define that era showed Mitchell and Paul standing together on the deck of a Navy ship, both in uniform, both looking out toward the horizon. Neither of them was smiling. Both of them had the expression of people who had seen too much, knew too much, and understood the weight of the choices they had made. That photograph would be used in military academies and officer training programs for decades, a visual reminder of what courage and integrity actually looked like. But, in the moment when the photograph was taken, both men were thinking about the ones who hadn't come home. Jenkins. Martinez. The others who had died because corruption had been allowed to fester in the highest levels of command. Those men would never know that their deaths had led to massive reform. They would never know that their sacrifice had made the military stronger. But, the people who survived knew. And, they carried that knowledge with them every day for the rest of their lives. The operation that had gone wrong on that beach in the Arabian Sea had ultimately led to something far more significant than any single mission could have achieved. It had exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military command. It had brought down one of the most senior officers in the Navy. And it had changed the military forever. All because one man had refused to die, had refused to give up, and had waited for the right moment when he could finally come in from the cold and tell the truth. All because another man had been willing to listen, to trust, and to act on that trust even when it meant challenging the military hierarchy that had given him his career and his identity. This was their story. The story of the shot that rang out in the darkness. The story of the sniper who emerged from the water. The story of how an impossible ghost and a living commander had worked together to expose corruption and bring justice to an organization that had been betrayed by one of its own. And it was a story that would be remembered, whispered about in barracks and officer clubs, studied in academies and training centers, and discussed by historians and military analysts for generations to come. Because at its heart, it was a story about what it meant to be a soldier, what it meant to be loyal to something greater than yourself, and what it meant to have the courage to do what was right, no matter what the cost.